During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Pastors were a substantial influence in America achieving its independence, but they were also just as substantial in helping America get its constitutional form of government. Right. So pastors were involved across the board in all aspects of culture, all aspects of society. They didn't have this carve-out like we do today that says, oh, you can't talk about that, you can't get involved in that. A citizen was eligible to be involved in every aspect of life and culture. Pastors were citizens. They could be involved. Now today, we've made them less than citizens. Well, since you're a pastor, you can't talk about that. You can't say that. Everyone else gets free speech, but you're a pastor, so you can't talk about that. You can't say that. So we've carved out and made pastors less.
180 degrees difference again.
That's right. Because once we got out of the American Revolution, we were governing ourselves under the Articles of Confederation. That was okay as a starting place, but it was a terrible form of government, really weak, really inefficient. It couldn't fund itself. It had no enforcement mechanism. So preachers that were serving in the Continental Congress, folks like John Witherspoon, who's a signer of the Declaration, but he's a minister of the gospel, he was one of the first to start saying, we've got to get rid of this form of government. We've got to go to something much better. We need a constitutional form of government. Right. So the whole movement toward getting the Constitution, preachers were right in the forefront of leading that movement. And so as we moved into that period of the Constitutional Convention, actually creating and drafting the Constitution, preachers were still giving input on the things that needed to be in it because, again, just as in the American Revolution, they were some of the great intellectual sources in the founding era. Let's consider the impact of pastors on America's worldview 2 centuries ago. Today, we say that the Bible relates to every area of life, but back then we proved it in a manner that we rarely do today. We can see this simply by examining the sermon topics of earlier generations. And we have literally hundreds and even thousands of published sermons from early America. By the way, a published sermon like these represents only a small fraction of all the sermons preached in those days. Unlike today, where sermons are taped and put on file and reproduced on demand, 2 centuries ago it cost a considerable amount in both time and money to publish a sermon. So unless the demand for that sermon had been especially high from those who had heard it, it was not published. Therefore, a published sermon was a sermon that had had a significant life-changing impact on the listeners. The topics of these early sermons demonstrate that the church truly believed and taught the nation that there was nothing in all of life that the Bible did not address either directly or indirectly. For example, in 1755, when New England suffered an earthquake, the sermons following that event addressed earthquakes. In other words, the church said, we've just had an earthquake. What does the Bible teach us about earthquakes? And you can see from the title that this was a 5-part sermon series on what the Bible said about earthquakes. This sermon is from 5 years later. The topic is the Great Fire in Boston. In other words, there's just been a tragic event. What principles does the Bible provide to deal with this tragedy? By the way, these 2 sermons were preached by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, one of the ministers specifically cited by John Adams as being behind our independence. And here's a sermon on a solar eclipse. I can safely say I've never heard a sermon on a solar eclipse. Yet it's amazing how many verses there are in this sermon that specifically address eclipses, the sun being darkened or the moon being darkened. You see, the church taught the nation of practical Christianity. No matter what occurs in any area of life, go to the Bible first, for it has the answers. And although this sermon is from 1851 and obviously not from the founding era, it still maintained a relevance to real life. Notice the topic, a sermon on a moral view of railroads. This minister pointed out that railroads were a part of transportation. And after he went through what the Bible taught about transportation, he then showed how railroads fit into God's overall transportation plan. Returning back to the founding era, this sermon is on the infirmities and comforts of old age. This doesn't seem to be a popular sermon topic today, yet we all know that aging has its challenges. And since aging has been going on since the beginning of mankind, don't we think that God might offer advice on the issues of aging? Indeed he does, and it's given here in this sermon. 2 centuries ago, we also had sermons on topics that might cause many to raise their eyebrows today. For example, this is called an execution sermon. It's a sermon preached on the execution of Henry Blackburn for the murder of George Wilkinson. You mean that when someone was put to death, we had a sermon on it? Yes, and often such sermons were based on the passage in Romans 13, where the Scriptures declare that God has given the sword to civil government. The sermon would investigate whether an execution was a proper use of the sword by civil government. This type of sermon was considered an occasional sermon, for it was a sermon that was preached because of a significant occasion. But there were also many types of sermons that were called annual sermons, sermons on specific topics preached annually. This annual sermon is called an artillery sermon. Once a year, the military assembled together and had a minister address the military to lay out from the Scriptures the proper role of the military. This clearly is a biblical subject addressed in both the Old and the New Testaments. Even John the Baptist had specific instructions for soldiers and officers as he was baptizing.
I can't help but just be impacted by the role reversal.
Mm-hmm. There was such influence there.
There was absolute influence held by the ministers of the gospel, and for the purpose of the spreading of the gospel, and for the purpose of creating our nation. And now a pastor, modern day, is even restricted from the pulpit to do what Congress asked the pastors to do by spreading the word about certain things that needed to be distributed through America.
Well, pastors are even being emasculated by the documents they themselves created that have now been turned on their head.
Wow.
I mean, if you go, you have the Declaration. Pastor's really a huge part of that. As a matter of fact, this rarely gets pointed out, but of the 56 signers of our national birth certificate, Declaration of Independence, 24 of the 56 held what are called Bible school or seminary degrees. So roughly half the signers of the Declaration have been trained for the ministry. Well, that's fairly substantial influence.
Yeah.
Then you move to the Constitution. They had substantial influence there. Again, 44 of them were involved in the ratification process. States held ratification in the churches, etc. Now you move into the original form of government, the original constitutional form of government. First time the federal Congress meets. You got ministers right there again. As a matter of fact, the man chosen by his peers to be the first ever Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives was a minister of the gospel, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, first Speaker of the House. His brother was in Congress with him, and that was John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who was also a preacher of the gospel. These two guys worked on forming the Bill of Rights. As a matter of fact, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, there's only 2 signatures at the bottom of the Bill of Rights, and one is Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. So our Bill of Rights, now we're being told, Bill of Rights, separation of church and state, you preachers can't say anything. Wait a minute, time out. We don't even have the Bill of Rights if it wasn't for preachers like Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg being in a leadership position exerting what he did. So now the very things that faith and that people of faith and that ministers have created have now become a club to beat them back out of the very arenas that they gave freedoms to the rest of us in. It's unbelievable.